He's the best. He's
Yeah.
such a good guy. He's such a good actor, and we just always talk about when we do scenes together, we feel very lost.
People became concerned about Sara Gilbert long before any headlines started asking questions. It happened in small moments. A pause during an interview that lasted just a little too long. A tired smile that disappeared the second cameras cut away. A look in her eyes that longtime fans immediately recognized as something deeper than simple exhaustion. And honestly, that's what made it unsettling. Because Sara Gilbert was never the kind of celebrity people expected to fall apart publicly. She always seemed different from the rest of Hollywood. Calm. Intelligent. Emotionally careful. Even as a child star, she carried herself like someone trying to stay grounded while chaos moved around her constantly. While other young celebrities spiraled publicly, Sara often looked like the quiet person in the room watching everything carefully before speaking. But then something started changing. Not dramatically. Slowly. And once people began noticing those subtle emotional shifts, they couldn't stop seeing them. Because this wasn't a story about scandal. It was a story about pressure, identity, burnout. And a woman who spent most of her life performing stability while privately carrying emotional weight few people fully understood. But what happened next changed the way many fans saw Sara Gilbert forever. Long before the concern, long before the silence. Sara Gilbert had already spent decades living under public attention. She became famous incredibly young. Millions first knew her as Darlene Connor on Roseanne, the sarcastic middle daughter whose dry humor made her instantly unforgettable. But what made audiences connect with Sara wasn't just the comedy. It was the realism. She didn't feel polished like most sitcom child stars. She didn't look overly rehearsed or desperate for attention. Sara felt authentic in a way television rarely allows people to be. Quietly funny. Emotionally guarded. Sharp enough to notice things other people missed. And almost overnight, she became one of the defining young faces of television in the late 1980s and early 1990s. From the outside, her life looked almost ideal. Hit television show. Massive popularity. Industry respect before adulthood even fully began. But fame becomes complicated when it starts during childhood. Because while millions watched Sara grow up on screen, she was still trying to understand herself privately at the exact same time. And according to Sara herself later on, that emotional pressure became overwhelming much earlier than fans realized. Behind the calm television image, there was confusion. Pressure. Fear about what might happen if people fully understood who she really was. But the truth behind that struggle became even more emotional later. During her teenage years, Sara began privately questioning her sexuality while working closely with her Roseanne co-star Johnny Galecki, who she briefly dated off-screen. At first, the relationship looked completely normal publicly. Fans saw two young actors growing close naturally while filming together every day. But privately, Sara later admitted something painful. She realized she was gay during that relationship. And suddenly, everything inside her life became emotionally more complicated. No one expected this from someone so young. Because while audiences simply saw a talented actress delivering sarcastic one-liners on television every week, Sara was privately carrying fears that felt enormous at the time. Especially in Hollywood during the 1990s. She later described feeling emotionally overwhelmed trying to balance public expectations with private truth. There were fears about career damage. Fear about judgment. Fear about losing control of her own identity once the public became involved. And honestly, that's what makes her story hit differently now. Because many people assume celebrity struggles begin after fame destroys someone publicly. But sometimes the damage starts quietly. Internally. Long before anyone notices cracks on the surface. And for Sara Gilbert, those emotional pressures never fully disappeared. Even after Roseanne ended, she continued pushing herself professionally. Acting, writing, producing, developing projects behind the scenes. Inside Hollywood, people respected Sara deeply because she seemed thoughtful in an industry often built around ego and performance. She wasn't loud. She wasn't attention-seeking. She came across like someone trying to create meaningful work while protecting her personal life at the same time. During her teenage years, Sara began privately questioning her sexuality while working closely with her Roseanne co-star Johnny Galecki, who she briefly dated off-screen. At first, the relationship looked completely normal publicly. Fans saw two young actors growing close naturally while filming together every day. But privately, Sara later admitted something painful. She realized she was gay during that relationship. And suddenly, everything inside her life became emotionally more complicated. No one expected this from someone so young. Because while audiences simply saw a talented actress delivering sarcastic one-liners on television every week, Sara was privately carrying fears that felt enormous at the time. Especially in Hollywood during the 1990s. She later described feeling emotionally overwhelmed trying to balance public expectations with private truth. There were fears about career damage. Fear about judgment. Fear about losing control of her own identity once the public became involved. And honestly, that's what makes her story hit differently now. Because many people assume celebrity struggles begin after fame destroys someone publicly. But sometimes the damage starts quietly. Internally. Long before anyone notices cracks on the surface. And for Sara Gilbert, those emotional pressures never fully disappeared. Even after Roseanne ended, she continued pushing herself professionally. Acting, writing, producing, developing projects behind the scenes. Inside Hollywood, people respected Sara deeply because she seemed thoughtful in an industry often built around ego and performance. She wasn't loud. She wasn't attention-seeking. She came across like someone trying to create meaningful work while protecting her personal life at the same time. Then came the talk. At first, the daytime series looked like the perfect fit for her. Sara helped create the show herself. She became one of its central personalities almost immediately. Viewers appreciated how calm and emotionally grounded she felt compared to louder television hosts. But over time, something began shifting again. Fans noticed it slowly. Her smile looked more strained. Her posture more tense. There were moments where she seemed emotionally exhausted even while trying to remain professional on camera. At first, viewers ignored those signs. But what happened next changed everything. During later interviews, Sara admitted balancing work, motherhood, public attention, and emotional stress had become deeply overwhelming at times. And suddenly, years of television appearances started looking different. Because once audiences heard her describe that emotional exhaustion openly, they began re-evaluating small moments they had noticed before but never fully understood. The pauses. The careful answers. The emotional restraint. It no longer felt like personality. It felt like survival. And honestly, that realization hit people hard. Because Sara Gilbert had spent years building a public image around intelligence and composure. She looked like someone holding life together carefully while chaos existed everywhere else. But behind the scenes, the pressure had apparently been building quietly for years. And then things took an even heavier emotional turn. Sara eventually announced she was leaving the talk. Publicly, the explanation sounded understandable. She wanted more time with family. She needed to focus on personal priorities. She spoke carefully, professionally, trying to stay composed while addressing viewers directly. But longtime fans noticed something immediately. She looked emotional trying to get through the announcement. Her voice cracked slightly. She paused several times. At moments, it almost seemed like she was fighting tears in real time while cameras kept rolling. And honestly, audiences felt that. Because this didn't feel like someone casually walking away from a successful television job. It felt like someone emotionally drained after carrying too much pressure for too long. No scandal. No explosive controversy. No dramatic breakdown. Just exhaustion quietly becoming impossible to hide anymore. And according to people familiar with daytime television, the emotional demands behind those shows can become overwhelming very quickly. Constant visibility. Daily conversations about personal issues. Pressure to appear emotionally open every single day. That kind of exposure changes people over time. Especially someone naturally private like Sara Gilbert. But the truth behind her emotional struggles became even sadder once people started looking at the bigger picture. Because throughout most of her career, Sara often seemed caught between two different identities publicly. The private person she naturally was. And the television personality the industry expected her to become. That conflict showed up constantly in subtle ways. During interviews, there were moments where she looked visibly uncomfortable discussing deeply personal parts of her life. Sometimes she laughed nervously before answering emotional questions. Other times she redirected conversations quickly, almost instinctively protecting herself from being emotionally exposed too much. And honestly, millions of people understood that feeling immediately. There's something exhausting about constantly explaining yourself to the world. Especially when public attention begins before you even fully understand yourself yet. Sara Gilbert spent most of her life being watched. Child. As a teenager. As a young. And somewhere inside all that attention, fans started sensing someone trying desperately not to lose herself completely. That realization changed everything. Because suddenly Sara Gilbert no longer looked like just another celebrity moving through Hollywood. She looked human. A woman quietly carrying years of emotional pressure while still trying to function professionally in front of millions of people. And honestly, those stories often become the saddest ones. Not because they explode dramatically. Because they happen slowly. In silence. In pauses. In exhaustion people almost miss until it becomes impossible not to notice anymore. But what happened next surprised fans again. Instead of chasing more visibility after leaving the talk, Sara became even more private publicly. Her appearances grew more selective. Interviews became less frequent. She seemed increasingly focused on protecting her emotional world instead of feeding Hollywood's constant demand for access. And while some people worried about her disappearance from public life, others understood it completely. Because suddenly her distance from Hollywood didn't feel mysterious anymore. It felt necessary. And maybe that's the part of Sara Gilbert's story that stays with people emotionally. Not scandal. Not destruction. Not downfall. Burnout. The kind that builds quietly over decades while someone continues smiling professionally through it. And once audiences recognized that emotional weight, concern around Sara became much deeper than simple celebrity curiosity. Because child stars carry a kind of loneliness most people never fully think about. Millions feel connected to them. Millions believe they know them personally. But very few understand what growing up under constant observation actually does emotionally over time. Sara Gilbert never really experienced adulthood privately. The world watched every version of her life unfold publicly. And eventually, that kind of visibility becomes emotionally expensive. Especially for someone naturally introverted and emotionally guarded. That's why even small moments around Sara now feel heavier to longtime fans. A quieter interview. A tired smile. A hesitation before answering something personal. Once people noticed those emotional cracks beneath the surface, they couldn't stop seeing them. Because suddenly the woman who once made audiences laugh every week looked like someone who had spent years quietly trying to survive enormous internal pressure without letting the world fully see it. And honestly, that realization changed how many people viewed her forever. Today, Sara Gilbert continues working selectively while living a far more private life than many celebrities choose. And although she still appears publicly from time to time, the energy around her feels different now. More careful. More protective. More emotionally distant from the spotlight itself. Longtime fans notice it immediately. Because once you understand how much emotional pressure someone has carried internally, even ordinary moments begin feeling more meaningful. And maybe that's why so many people remain deeply concerned about Sara Gilbert now. Not because she failed. Not because her career disappeared. Because people finally realized how emotionally exhausting Hollywood can become, especially for someone who entered it as a child and spent decades trying to protect pieces of herself from being consumed by public attention. And perhaps the saddest part of all is this. Sara Gilbert spent years making millions of people laugh while privately carrying struggles most viewers never even knew existed. The identity confusion. The pressure. The emotional exhaustion. The constant need to appear composed while quietly fighting burnout underneath. And once fans finally saw those cracks beneath the surface, they couldn't stop thinking about them. Because sometimes the most heartbreaking celebrity stories are not the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the quiet ones. The stories where someone keeps functioning. Keeps smiling. Keeps showing up. While privately carrying far more than anyone realizes. So what do you think about Sara Gilbert and the emotional struggles she's faced behind the scenes? Do you believe Hollywood pressure slowly changed her over time, or do you think stepping away from constant public attention may have finally helped her protect her peace? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy emotional Hollywood stories that reveal what was really happening behind the fame, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next story might completely change the way you see another celebrity you thought you already understood.